Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm just going to be going back over the non-fiction books that I've read this year and choosing my favourites from this. There's ended up being a top 12 because I'm indecisive. But oh, hello, and Cindy is joining us. Hello, Cindy. With that as well, these are non-fiction books that were released this year, or I'm kind of being a bit more lenient here with sort of some books that were released sort of late last year, because I realised what happened before was that I was very strict last year on books that were only released that calendar year, and there were books that were released like the December before that I couldn't count. So just going with books released in 2022 and or late 2021. So let's get started. Looking through my non-fiction picks for the year, so many of them have ended up being basically a mixture of nature books and memoirs by gay men, basically. So it should be interesting to see how this list goes, but very excited for it nonetheless. So let's go through them. So starting off with one of those nature books, we have Wildfell by Lee Schofield. And I really greatly enjoyed this book this year. I think it's a phenomenal book. It talks a lot about the idea of rewilding, but it goes quite a lot deeper than that. There's a lot in this book around how to make everything kind of come together, really, in terms of sort of our policies around farming and agriculture and various other things, but also what we think in terms of how we convince people and make the argument for these things, because often people have been doing things their way for many years. There are lots of problems. They're worried about their sort of finances, particularly in the case of farmers in this book. And so this book has this really interesting sort of dialogue almost between that kind of happening, the sort of the politics of that, but also where it's worked really well, where areas have just been allowed to do their own thing, and you see it working really beautifully in a case of sort of part of Norway in this book. Really beautiful book, and just sumptuous phrases all the way throughout, which I just thought were gorgeous. Next up, keeping this very much within the nature frame, and a lot of these you'll notice are sort of books from the Wainwright Prize this year, just because it's often how I discover so many really amazing books. But Alice Bell's Our Greatest Experiment, I thought, was a really fantastic and very accessible and funny way of learning a little bit about the history of environmentalism, of how we've got to this problem now in terms of environmental crisis and collapse, and all of those sorts of things as well. So really beautiful book, very funny, very clever, and kind of full of these little sort of tidbits of information that I just thought were kind of fun. Like, you sort of, you know, just sort of really silly, almost unnecessary facts almost, but that really created this very rich and important narrative around climate change. Only two more nature books. So next there was Goshawk Summer, which by James Aldred, which I thought was fantastic. It's again beautifully written, so clever and so captivating, as he captures a really interesting part of the last few years, which was around lockdown, around sort of the pandemic, and there's this interesting moment where he is basically following these goshawks and trying to learn a bit more about them, and he's so impressed by the kind of majesty and the beauty of them. And in doing so, he is sort of watching this world go by at a time where the rest of the world has really dramatically changed. So he's suddenly doing so much work to kind of try and hold on to his sort of sanity as he goes through this, you know, trying to hold on to doing all this really important work of kind of being able to understand the natural world, all while being incredibly worried about what's going to happen to the world next. And there's something so interesting about the fact that these goshawks just go and live their lives kind of independent of us, as we're all sort of running around scrabbling, trying to work out what on earth we do during lockdown. And there's something very still and quiet about this book, but also just incredibly beautiful, I think. And I think very rightly was one of the winners of the Wainwright Prizes this year. Next up, Shadowlands by Dr. Matthew Green. A really quite stunning book about some of the places that we're losing for various reasons. So in this book we learn about sort of old towns that sort of were left to sort of go into and fall into ruin, but the echoes of which still exist with us now. We have places like there's a Welsh, an old sort of Welsh village that was a really interesting hub of culture and Welsh language literature and things like that, that sadly was flooded intentionally to make way for a sort of a building project that would then help parts of England, obviously very controversially, and this was sort of a huge thing. So we lose all of these places, but there are sort of echoes and sort of shadows of them still existing within where we are now. So I thought this book was so captivating, and I don't really understand how you would begin to start a book like this, right? How do you go about finding all the various places to research and examine in this? I thought it was such a dynamic and interesting read, and it just filled me with so much sort of intrigue about some of the places that exist in the UK. And yeah, I just really loved it. I think it's a really clever and insightful book, and there's something quite profound about seeing all of the areas that no longer exist, but that have dramatically shaped the landscape around us as well. Next up, I did do a separate video about this book because I love it so much. I think a book that is easily my book of the year, and that is All Down Darkness Wide by Seán Hewitt, which I just think is staggering. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It deals with, it's a memoir of Seán Hewitt, of him talking about various relationships he's had in his life, and particularly some of the really important relationships that have shaped who he is. So a relationship with a man who then he lost touch with, and then it sort of transpires later has died or sort of disappeared, and all of these things. Then another quite intense relationship with a man that is fraught with these difficulties. You know, his partner's mental health really takes a tumble, and Seán finds himself being both somebody loving him and supporting him, but also being completely broken down and burnt out by the process as well. And it's just a beautiful, moving book. I, as you may know, sort of tend to read fairly quickly. I sort of have gotten through a fair few books this year, and this was a book that really forced me to slow down. I remember picking it up, and I was about to be on a long train journey, and I read the first 50 pages and thought, I need to stop after these 50 pages. I'm just going to stop. This is a beautiful moment to end it for now, and I'm going to come back to this because I want to give this book my full attention. I want to make sure that every time I'm reading bits of it, I'm in that mode, not just sort of, you know, sort of being like, oh, I'm only 20 pages from the end, let's just quickly finish it now. I needed to give this book time, and it really profoundly moved me. I think it's an incredible book. It's so poignant in terms of what it says around sexuality and shame and mental health and trauma and joy and so many other things. I just think it's stunning, and his writing is ridiculously lyrical and beautiful and everything. And I loved this. I loved this so much. Yeah, this is easily my book of the year. I just think it's a masterpiece, and I'm getting emotional. I'm so deeply grateful that Seán Hewitt wrote this and decided to share it with us, because I think it's so profound and so truthful and honest in a way that I think we need. So yeah, anyway, I'm gonna change books before I start crying. On a lighter note, but no less profound, we have A Deep Sniff by Adam Zmith. And this is a really interesting book in so many ways. It's a really playful look on one hand at queer desire and joy and sexuality and so many things, but it's also quite a moving meditation on sort of how queer history has changed and grown in sort of recent years, and particularly sort of told through the lens of poppers, as on the front cover. And at first that doesn't sound like it should work, and this book almost made me angry with how it somehow managed to like combine these things that shouldn't work, and it was so beautiful and brilliant. So it takes this central idea around poppers, and poppers as a tool of allowing people to kind of come out of their shells and really be present in a moment and really experience joy and release and escape. And it uses that as a sort of tool basically for looking at how sexuality and the history of sexuality and desire has worked. That actually during, for example, the AIDS crisis, when poppers were thought to be a mode of transmission, that sort of suddenly problematized that whole thing. But actually, by the same token, it was also a way for people to release themselves or be relieved from the fear of the sort of spectre of HIV and AIDS that were hanging across the community at the time. And so this book then sort of is a way of looking at how this has been really quite complicated for queer people for many years. The sort of how can they sort of step outside of themselves but also be very truly authentically themselves in a world that might not always be necessarily fair to them. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and I do strongly urge you to pick it up. It won the Polari Prize very, very rightfully, and I mean I love this book anyway. I was very glad to see it win. It's a joy. It's a real joy, and I had the luck of meeting Adam at the Polari Prize and sort of getting him to sign it, and just sort of generally fanboying really. So there we go. Also on that Polari Prize shortlist, or on the sort of shortlist for those prizes, was this book here, Valentine, Ackland, A Transgressive Life by Frances Bingham. And I thought this was a really brilliant book that caught me by surprise. I spoke about it on a video with Seán, the Book Maniac, recently as well, where I dive into a bit of detail about it. But I think the thing I really loved about this book is, not knowing anything about Valentine Ackland before I started reading, I was fully immersed in this world of this very complicated and intriguing figure of Valentine, who liked to sort of play with gender and how she was perceived. You know, she'd often wear typically male clothing. She would, you know, she was in a relationship with the poet Sylvia Townsend Warner. There were also many other complicated aspects to their relationship, but she sort of never really took off it as a writer in quite the same way as Sylvia did. And so she's this interesting character who's often ignored in bits of history. In fact, you know, I knew nothing about her either. But actually it's interspersed with bits of her poems, and we learn about, you know, specific times when she would have written some of these poems and what was probably going through her head. And she's just this really curious, interesting figure, and it's so well written as a biography, in a way that I just thought was really clever. It's just, it again almost shouldn't work. It's someone I don't know much about. It's told in a really sort of interesting style, and I just found myself fully loving this book and thinking it was so deeply clever. And I really, yeah, I think, you know, massive props to Frances Bingham for bringing Valentine's world to life in such a vivid and beautiful way. Next up, Thea Lenarduzzi with Dandelions. And this I just thought was such a clever and fun book. And I say fun, there's a lot that's quite sad about this book, but really interesting in how it approaches things. It does one of those things that I love when books do, is sort of taking several things that seem quite disparate and finding a common link between them and kind of connecting the dots in such an interesting way. And so for me, Dandelions, I just thought was such an interesting way of looking at memoir and the ideas of memory and kind of collective history and so many things. So we have at the heart of this, we learn about this sort of mother figure who you know, moves country and is trying to find herself in her new existence. And there's a sort of spectre behind all of this of quite a dark period of history, you know, particularly looking at sort of older Italian history in sort of the 20th century. There's a lot of quite dark things going on. And so this sort of replanting of a character is told also through this idea of dandelions, which are to some people seen as a weed, but are also used in recipes and are you know, potentially medicinal as well. And they're also hardy, and therefore a crop that keeps on appearing in the unlikeliest of places and keeps surviving. Again, there's a really interesting metaphor being drawn here between sort of the immigrant experience of moving somewhere and the sort of resilience and hardiness that's needed often to survive, even if they appear at first to be these weeds, unwanted or whatever in a country. And this book, I think, just connects so many interesting dots in such an interesting way. And I thought it was such a beautiful discussion of this sort of relationship between a mother and daughter, in a way where there's so much that's unsaid. You know, how do you tell your child about the life you had when you sort of fled somewhere that you didn't think would necessarily be safe, and you have this new transplanted life somewhere else, and you're trying to make it work? How do you tell your child that? And then if you've survived it and don't want to talk about it anymore, what happens to those stories and those ideas? And I think this book is such a clever way of approaching such a difficult topic. And I just found it so utterly engaging and beautiful and wonderful. And yeah, massive sort of commendations to the author for having managed to write something like this. Next up, Outrageous by Paul Baker. And this is a book that appeals to me on many levels, but is partly as well just because I love Paul Baker. I wrote a lot of my dissertation on Paul Baker, well, using his work rather, because he writes a lot about Polari, the sort of lost, well, not lost, but the sort of older sort of slang used by sort of essentially what we'd probably term now gay and bisexual men, who used it as a sort of code language to be able to meet up securely and sort of stay safe and be able to communicate and kind of, you know, essentially almost code switch basically, and sort of, you know, have this other language they can fall back on to make it known who they are. And Paul Baker's written a lot about Polari and about LGBTQ history, and in Outrageous he turns his focus on Section 28, which is a huge policy with massive ramifications in the UK, a law that basically forbade teachers and many other sort of agencies from explicitly talking about LGBTQ life, even to the granular level of teachers being afraid of even mentioning that somebody might be gay, or if a child wanted to come out to them because they felt safe, that actually really compromised the teacher's safety. I grew up in a time where my first couple of years of schooling would have been under Section 28, and it would have been lifted while I was still at school, I believe. And so, but that still meant that teachers had been trained and for many years had sort of, you know, stopped themselves from talking about various things. And it means that so many people, including teachers, lost out on the ability to really authentically be themselves. And Paul Baker in this book really charts the history of that law coming into effect and how the law was eventually demolished alongside all of the people who were damaged and hurt by everything in the meantime. This is such a profound and beautiful history of a very specific moment in LGBTQ history in the UK, and a really important one. I'm so glad that Paul Baker has written this. I think it's a really vital and intelligent book, full of compassion, but there is a sense of anger that sort of courses through it very rightfully, of what we've lost along the way. And I think this book is brilliant, and I think Paul Baker is brilliant. I'm going to try not to completely fanboy here about Paul Baker, but I think it's a really vital book for so many reasons. Next up, Cells by Gavin McCrea. And again, I did a separate video on this because I just think this book is stunning. This is a very raw and honest memoir of Gavin McCrea's life, particularly various things to do with the relationship between him and his mother, a lot to do with shame and violence. There's a lot in this book as well just around really trying to navigate family dynamics and how complicated those can be. And so we sort of start the book with Gavin McCrea and his mother living together, and a large part of that is sort of, there's some degree of financial element to that, but also we sort of have them living together during periods of lockdown. And them living together again suddenly gives Gavin McCrea a bit more of a chance to look back on some of the history of his life and of the various conflicts and moments of love between him and his mother. And so this book is really complicated in the relationships it tells, but it does it in such a beautiful way, where he will flash back to various parts of his life where, for example, he was beaten up for who he was, or for who people suspected he was even. We learn a lot about some of his early relationships and how complicated some of those were. We learn about his HIV status and this sort of really difficult moment of him grappling with that. We learn a lot in this book, all so profound and beautiful and really heartbreaking, and he doesn't spare anybody in this. There's a sort of acknowledgements part at the end where he talks about intentionally not sending a copy of the book to, an early draft of the book to people mentioned in it, because he didn't want to dilute the truth or hide things from people by not, if he let them know in advance, they probably would have vetoed a lot of it, and he had to be honest. It was really important for him that he had to tell the absolute truth in every single one of these scenarios. And so we're left with this book that is so raw, in a beautiful way. It's difficult to read at times because of just how painful some of these memories must have been for him, but it's such a brilliant book, and I think this is a really fantastic way of doing memoir, of really delving deep into some of the darkest moments of his life, and with these really clever, witty observations. He'll talk about his mum pottering around the house and doing things that seem illogical in a way that I recognize in people I know. It's so true and so real, and I love it. I think it's fantastic. Easily, again, up there with one of my top books of the year. I think it's incredible. It's a really bloody good book, basically. Another book that I've raved about a lot this year is Sally Hayden's My Fourth Time We Drowned, and it's a ridiculously difficult book at times to read, but no less important or beautiful for that reason. This book looks a lot at migration to the EU, typically from sort of North Africa and the Middle East, and it's a really quite stunning book for how she manages to piece it together. Essentially, the key sort of idea, I suppose, behind it is that Sally Hayden was contacted by a group of detainees in a detention centre, and they managed to sort of get a message out to her to try and help. And she sort of thought, well, I don't know how I can help. And they'd reached out to her as a journalist who'd previously covered some stories around migration and a few other things. And what comes out from this book next is both a deeply caring and sensitive book around the struggles faced by many people and why they leave, but also a scathing takedown of some of the policies and political choices that have led to this. So she is incredibly good, I think, in this book at conveying both anger at everything that's going on and the injustice of it, but also really not losing touch of the human effect of all of this as well. And I listened to the audiobook version of this, which was incredible, if also very difficult, because one part of the beginning of this audiobook is Sally Hayden. Sally Hayden's included some of the messages that were sent to her, some of the audio messages by some of these detainees. And you hear, for example, people in an immigration centre or a detention centre with, like gunfire or bombs or whatever going off in the background. It's a really difficult read at times. This is not a comforting book, but there's something about Sally Hayden's absolute anger and ire in a very powerful, rightful way, and her real investigative eye of a journalist that really ties this book together in such a powerful way. I think it's a brilliant book. I think it is so clever with how it approaches so many things, and I just think this is a brilliant book. I loved it. I've thought about it a lot since, and I think very rightfully it won a couple of prizes and has been shortlisted for some others. It's a phenomenal book, and I think Sally Hayden really deserves a lot of love for having created something so difficult but also so important, particularly in the current context. And yeah, I think it's incredibly well done. And last but not least, we have Super Infinite by Katharine Rundell. And this is a history of John Donne, which on the surface doesn't sound like it'd be the most exciting thing if, again, you don't know much about John Donne. This is written so brilliantly. it really reads almost like a novel, in just the way Katharine Rundell is able to capture the smallest minuscule details of John Donne's life, and kind of draw a real line through all of his experiences. So his sort of desire for death at various points of his life, and his complicated relationship with religion, where he at times is incredibly pious and at times is incredibly lost in being able to understand what he wants from religion, or whether he even believes. And in the midst of it, we learn a lot about his writing, and coming as somebody who'd only read The Flea, I think, at school, and maybe hadn't read anything else, I really greatly enjoyed learning a lot more about him. And it's such a captivating book. It won the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, and I absolutely see why. I think a large part of their judging criteria is that regardless of what the subject matter of the book is, it should be a book that is accessible, that is clever, that is interesting to the audience. And this book ticks all of those boxes for me. I think it's such an interesting, powerful book, in terms of what it says about religion, about death, about life, and so I just think it's fantastic. Yeah. So those are the books, the non-fiction books I've really enjoyed this year. There have been so many other books I've really had a great time with. I think these 12 feel for me like the 12 books that I'm absolutely going to be raving about and recommending and thinking about a lot and buying as gifts for people and all of those sorts of things. I loved these books. I think they're so brilliant. And like I mentioned, you know, Sean Hewitt's All Down Darkness Wide, I think, is a particular favourite, where this book is just my top book of the year by far. I think it's a stunning book, but there are so many other wonderful books like the ones I've mentioned here, and I'm sure in the next week or so I'm going to end up reading something else which could have made the list. This is also why the fiction video is taking a little bit longer, because there are a couple of books I've been meaning to read all year, that I feel like I might love, but I don't want to make the video and then have to go back and be like, oh, also this one. Whereas I'm probably not going to read much more non-fiction this year, so this video is fine for that. Anyway, I've been Bod the Booker. I hope you've had a great year. I'd love to hear your favourite books from the year as well. Take care, have a wonderful break, and see you all soon. Bye bye.